Hey guys, welcome to JavaScript for Absolute Beginners. So in this mini course, we're going to be looking at all of the fundamentals of the JavaScript programming language. Now, if you're already fairly good with JavaScript, this course probably won't give you too much more than you already know, but feel free to use it as a refresher or to just polish up on your skills or just to watch it for fun, if that's your thing. All right, so we're going to be covering a lot in a relatively short amount of time, about an hour or so. We're going to look at things like variables, arrays, loops, if-else statements, events, things like that, form validation. Pretty simple stuff. So forgive me if I kind of go over things you already know. I'm going to try not to spend too long on each subject, just get you just understanding the fundamentals so that you can actually start typing JavaScript on your own. Alright, so hopefully you guys enjoy it and you learn something from it. So let's get started. So what is JavaScript? A brief definition would be a programming language that is used to make web pages interactive. Alright, it's what's known as an interpreted language. And what this means is that it doesn't have to be compiled like languages such as Java or C or Visual Basic. And this makes things a lot easier for us. Okay, we can just run our code. We don't have to run it through a compiler or anything like that. Another really important thing to understand is that JavaScript is executed on the client's computer or in their browser. And languages like PHP, languages like Ruby with Ruby on Rails, they run on a server somewhere else. But with JavaScript, that actually runs on your computer. Alright, and again, this makes things much easier because we don't need any kind of special server or anything like that. We can simply create a JS file and include it in our HTML. Alright, it's also object-based. It's an object-oriented programming, although you don't have to use it like that. Now the difference between this and another object-oriented programming language like Java, it's prototype-based instead of class-based. All right, and we'll get into that later on. So I'm sure most of you know this already, but JavaScript is not Java. It has nothing to do with Java. Java is much more complex, and it's a high-level language that is in the same category as a language like C or C++. And those languages are typically used to build desktop applications, games, stuff like that. JavaScript is a scripting language, which means that it's a lightweight language that is interpreted by a web browser when the page is loaded. So this is basically what we'll be going over in this mini course. Variables, arrays, which are just basically groups of variables. Loops are used to iterate through data and then do whatever you'd like. I'll put it on the screen or whatever it may be. Conditionals, we're going to have if statements, if else, switches, comparisons and operators, objects, functions. We'll talk about program flow, data types such as strings, numbers, prototypes, and also events. Events is a big one. When we have interactive elements on our web page, we usually have some kind of event or action associated with that element. So what do you need to run JavaScript? All you need is a modern web browser. So Chrome, Firefox, Safari, or Internet Explorer. I would suggest Chrome, but everyone has their preference. To create JavaScript, all you need is a text editor. So you could use Windows Notepad. There's also Notepad++. There's Notepad 2. Sublime Text is what I use. TextMate, which I think is only for Mac. And then there's a ton of premium IDEs that you can use if you want to spend a little bit of money. Things like Dreamweaver. I don't even know any other ones. I've never bought an IDE. Sublime Text I use for most development. So HTML versus JavaScript. This doesn't really make sense to have them compare them because they're completely different and they work together. All right, HTML is a markup language and JavaScript is a programming language. A markup language is just that. It's used to display web pages. So to have things like paragraphs and headings, and HTML uses a tag syntax. And hopefully you already know at least the basics of HTML. If you don't, I would suggest learning that before you learn JavaScript. So what can you do with JavaScript? This is just a very minimal list. There's obviously a lot more, but you can do things like put content or text in an HTML page on the fly. You can make web pages interactive and responsive. You can detect user browsers and operating systems and other info. You can create cookies, which is basically holding data in memory. Validate forms. You can create animations and slideshows, scrollers, things like that. And you can even take it up a notch and start building applications using JavaScript frameworks like Angular, React, Backbone.js, things like that. All right. And then you have Node.js, which is JavaScript running on the server, which we'll look at a little bit, but I'm not going to really get into that. That's more advanced. All right, so enough of this, enough of these slides. Let's go ahead and write some code. All right, so before we can actually jump in and start writing JavaScript, we need to choose a text editor. All right, now this is strictly preference. I'm choosing to use Sublime Text, but there are some other choices that you may like better. All right, so let's take a look at some of them. All right, so the first text editor that we're going to look at is Sublime Text, and that's actually what I'll be using. Sublime Text is very simple, but it's also packed with all kinds of features. It's cross-platform. You can use it on Windows, Mac, or Linux. And it also has a long range of plugins that you can install and use to add additional functionality. All right, so that's what we'll be using. There's Sublime Text 2 and 3. I'll be using Sublime Text 3. Another really nice option is Notepad++, and this gives you Windows Notepad with a bunch of additional features. So one nice thing about this is the interface is very customizable. All right, you can make your toolbar as minimal or as rich as you would like. It has a document map so you can see where you're at in your work at any time, and also a tabbed interface so that you can work with multiple documents, auto completion, and text shortening. All right, so if you want to grab that, just go to notepad-plus-plus.org. Another option is Notepad 2, which, just like Notepad++, it's basically Windows Notepad with some additional features. I can't really say too much about it because I haven't really used it, but I've talked to a lot of different developers that really like it, especially for HTML and JavaScript. All right, another one is Emacs. Now, Emacs is a little difficult to use if you're a beginner, so I wouldn't really suggest it, but it is an option. It's been around for a long time. I think it was written in like 1976 or something like that. So that's another option you have. If you're on a Mac, TextMate is basically the equivalent to Notepad or Notepad++ for Mac. I've never used it. I don't use a Mac, but I've heard good things about it. All right, so like I said, we'll be using Sublime Text. If you want to grab that, just click on download, and you can see it's cross-platform. If you're using a Mac or Windows or Linux, 32 or 64-bit, you should be fine. I'm not going to go through the download or anything like that because I have it on my system, but it's just a standard Windows installer. So now we're going to talk about a really important part of not only JavaScript, but pretty much every programming language, and that is variables and data types. Let's take a look. All right, so before we get into variables and data types, I just want to show you the document that I created that we'll be working in. Okay, very simple. It's just an index.html file. We have all our base HTML. Right here, we're going to link a style sheet, style CSS, which I have here, if you want to go ahead and get that copied. And then we just have a header inside of the body and a container, which is where we'll put any output that we need to. All right, now to start writing JavaScript, we can do one of two things. We can either link a JavaScript file, or we can put it right in the HTML inside script tags. Now I'm just going to show you both methods, but we're going to use the script tags just for simplicity. All right, so let's say we want to link an external JavaScript file, what we would do is say script and then give it a source attribute, src, and then let's say we want to call it main.js, and then we need a closing script tag. Whoops. Alright, now let's save that, and then I'm going to just create a new document, and we'll call that main.js. Okay, we'll open that up, and just to test things, we're just going to send an alert, and we'll say file linked. Okay, save it, and make sure that index.html is saved, reload, and you can see we're getting file linked. Alright, so that's how you can link an external JavaScript file. But what we're going to do, we're going to get rid of that, and we're just going to put in script tags down at the bottom here. Okay, and just to test this, we'll say alert, and we'll say script tags work. Save it, reload, and we get script tags work. Okay, get rid of that. So let's talk about data types. Okay, so we have a couple different data types that we're going to be working with. Okay, we have number, we have strings or string, we have an array, and we have an object. Okay, I'm not going to get into arrays and objects right now. I'll be doing that in a little bit, but what we'll do is talk about numbers and strings. Alright, so let's create a variable. We can do that with the keyword var, and then we'll name it. We'll just call it number1, and let's set that to 35. Okay, now since it doesn't have quotes around it, it's going to be looked at as a number. If it had double quotes or single quotes, it would be looked at as a string. And just to show you that we can do something with that variable, we'll just do an alert, and we'll say number1. Okay, if we reload, you can see we get 35. Now, when you have a variable that is a number data type, you can perform math operations. So let's create another one. We'll call it number2, and let's just give it a value of 40, and then let's say alert number1 plus number2, and I'm sure you know what it's going to give us. Okay, so it's going to give us 75. It added the two numbers together. Now let's change these from the number data type to a string by putting quotes around them. Alright, now if we save and reload, we get 3540, because since it's looked at as a string, it's just doing what's called concatenating the two strings together. And if we want, we can concatenate stuff. We can concatenate text or other strings to these variables. So let's say actually we'll have to put this in quotes because it's a string. We'll say my favorite number is, and let's just take that one out. We can concatenate just like that, just like we did with the variable. Reload, and we get my favorite number is 35. Alright, so that's how you can put a variable inside of a string. Alright, and even if this was a number data type, that's still going to work. Okay. So now let's talk about the naming conventions of variables. Alright, so there's a couple different rules that we have to follow. Alright, so first one, variables can contain letters, numbers, underscores, and dollar signs. Okay, so these are the only characters that you should be using in your variables. Now, they should begin with a letter. Alright, even though you can have any of these four types, you want to start the variable with a letter. Now, they can also be started with an underscore or a dollar sign, alright, but we won't be doing that in this course. Okay, they're also case sensitive. Okay, so if you have, let's create a variable called test, and we'll set it to a string. This is a test, and then let's create a variable called test with a capital, with an uppercase T at the beginning, and we'll set that to this is another test. Okay, and then what we'll do is say alert test. We'll save that. Now if it weren't case sensitive, then this would give us this, because this test would overwrite this one. But if we reload, you can see we get this is a test. Okay, if we change that to an uppercase T and we reload, we get this is another test. So you can see that they are case sensitive, unlike HTML tags, which are not. Alright, so those are the basic rules. Now we also have different styles of variables. Alright, so we have something called camel case, which I'll give you an example. Let's say var, we'll say my number. Alright, this is camel case. And what that means is it's going to start with a lowercase letter, and then every word after that will be in uppercase. We'll start with an uppercase. So this, let's say my favorite number. Okay, so that's camel case. We also have something called partial case, which is very close to camel case, except the first word is also in uppercase. Alright, and then we also have the underscore style, which would be var my favorite number. Okay, so with this you can see each word is separated by an underscore, and this is often used in PHP, but also in the JavaScript world. Now, if you have experience in any other programming languages that uses variables, you'll notice that JavaScript follows a lot of the same rules and conventions. Now, notice with these, I just claimed the variable, I just declared it and didn't set it equal to anything. That's absolutely fine too. You're just initializing it without a value. Alright, so if you initialize it with var, then you can later on, let's say, my favorite number equals 5. And you don't have to use the var, it's already initialized. The next thing we're going to look at in JavaScript is arrays, and arrays are used to store multiple values in a single variable. So in our document we're going to go down to our script tags and let's create a very simple array. Alright, so when you declare an array, it is a variable, so you want to use var, and then we'll name it, let's call it colors. Alright, now we're going to set this equal to, and then we're going to open some brackets. Alright, and this is what defines it as an array. We could just leave it like this, and it's an initialized array. Okay, so let's add some values to this. We're going to add some strings, so we need quotes. We'll say red, blue, and green. Okay, so now we have an array of colors that has 3 different values inside of it. So how would we access, let's say, red? To do that, what we'll do is we'll do an alert, and we'll say colors. Now let me just show you what happens if we do that. Okay, so what it's going to do is it's going to just print out everything. So it's giving us all of the values. Now what if we want to target just the second value here, blue? So to do that, we would use just some square brackets after the variable, and let's put in 1. Okay, so if we save that and reload, you can see we're getting blue. Now you might be wondering why we put in 1 but we got the second value, and the reason for that is arrays are 0 based. Okay, so the first value of an array is always going to be 0. It doesn't start from 1. So we have 0, 1, 2. So if we go ahead and reload this, we're going to get red. Okay, if we put in 2, I'm sure you know what we're going to get. We're going to get green. If I put in 3 and reload, we get undefined because there is no third value here. So this is one way to create an array, but it's not the only one. Alright, so another thing we could do here is we could say var colors and set it equal to new array, and then just open up some parentheses. And then in here, we could say red, we'll say yellow, and orange. Alright, so that also creates an array. Now it's all preference on how you want to do it. I prefer the first way we did it just because it's a little easier to read, but this certainly does do the same thing. So let's say alert, and we'll get colors 2, and we should get orange. Okay. Now what if we wanted to add to this array? So of course we could just add in another value here, but we can also add it down here. So what we can do is say colors, and if we look at this array here, we have red, yellow, orange, which is 0, 1, 2, so we can set 3. Let's set 3 to green. Alright, and then of course we could do alert. Let's just alert colors, and we'll get red, yellow, orange, green. Now you might not always know how many values you have here, so this isn't really an effective way to add to an array. So the correct way, the better way to do this would be to use the push function. So to do that, we'll say colors.push. Okay, and what we'll want to push in is, let's say, purple. Alright, and then we'll say alert colors, and let's get the fourth one, which would be 3. Okay, if we reload, now we get purple. And this here, this is known as dot syntax. So we're taking an element, or an object in this case, which is an array, and we're calling the push function with the dot. Okay, so we're saying colors dot, and then a function called push, which we're passing in a parameter of purple. Alright, and we'll get more into this stuff later. You can also chain onto this, and you could add other functions as well. Now, up until this point, our array only has strings in it. Alright, so we can also, let's create an array called numbers, and we can set that to just an array of numbers, okay? And what makes them numbers is that there's no quotes around it, so it's not a string. So we could do something like alert, and let's say numbers 0 plus numbers 2. Okay, if we do that and reload, we get 11. It's giving us 5 plus 6. And not only that could you use numbers, but you could also mix and match. So we could also put a string in here, and let's say 7. Okay, we could certainly do that. And let's do alert numbers 2, which gives us 6. Actually, I want to do numbers 3, which should give us the string of 7. Now, a couple minutes ago, I showed you the .push function, which is also called a method. Okay, when you say methods and functions in JavaScript, it's generally the same thing, as well as properties and attributes. All right, and arrays can have these things. They can have properties and they can have methods. So let's look at the method of, the property of length. So what we can do here is say alert numbers dot length. And if we go ahead and we reload, we get 4, because the length pertains to how many values are in the array. So if I had something else here, let's say 155, and then we reload, now we're getting 6 because there's 6 there. So that's an example of a property. Now a method would be just a function, just like push that we just used. There's also one called sort. All right, now if it's a method or a function, it has to have parentheses on the back of it. So let's save that, and then what we'll do is reload, and it's going to sort them by value. Okay, so you can see the 1 is moved to the beginning, and it goes up to the string of 7, which it tacks on the end. Okay, we could also use one called reverse. All right, and if we go ahead and reload that, it's going to give us the reverse order from which it was created. So 55, you can see, is at the beginning. All right, so that's going to do it for arrays. So now we're going to take a look at loops. All right, so there's different types of loops, and I'm going to give you an example of each one. Now, if you have experience in other programming languages, chances are you know what a loop is. And the different types of loops, they run across a wide range of programming languages. For instance, a for loop. You have for loops in JavaScript, you have for loops in PHP, Java, really high-level languages. So if you know a for loop in another language, then this should be very easy to understand. All right, so the basic types of loops we're going to go over is a for loop, a while loop, and a Foreach loop, which is used for arrays. All right, so let's start out with a for loop. And loops, what they do is they iterate through something, whether it's an array or a result, rows from a database, whatever it may be. So let me give you just a very basic example. Okay, so we're going to say for. Okay, so structured just like a function. And this is going to take three different parameters. The first, we're going to set a variable. So we're going to say var, and we'll call it I. We're going to set it to 0 to begin with. All right, and these parameters are separated by semicolons. The next is going to be the condition. So what we're going to do is we're going to say as long as I is less than, let's say, 10. Okay, so that's the condition. And then the last one is to increment, and we want to increment by 1. So to do that, we can say I++. That's going to increment it by 1. Now, inside the curly braces is what we want to happen through each iteration. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a console log. And if you don't know what that is, it's just a way to print stuff out, kind of like we've been doing with alert. All right, so if I go into my Chrome browser and I hit F12, it's going to open up a console. All right, so just to give you a quick example, let's say console.log, and we'll just put in a string here. We'll say hello. Okay, if I save that and then we run it, you can see down here we're getting hello, and I can make this bigger. Okay, so you can put whatever you'd like, say 1, 2, 3, and we can print that out. So what we'll do is after each iteration, we're going to console log. All right, and what we want to output here is the I, okay, the I variable, because that's going to change through each iteration because we're adding 1 to it. So let's go ahead and console log I and reload. And you can see that it's starting at 0 because we set the variable I to 0, and then each iteration it's going to add to 1. It's going to add 1 to that until it meets this right here, I less than 10. All right, so as long as this is true, it's going to keep going. Now when you get to 9, it's going to stop, because if it goes to 10, this isn't true anymore. Okay, if you actually want to include the 10, you can say I is less than or equal to 10. And then if we run it, now you can see we're getting the 10. Okay, and I can put whatever I want here. If we say 20, it's going to loop through up to 20. Okay, and you could do whatever you want here. We could console log a string and attach it to it, and we'll say I love the number, and then I. All right, and then you can see it's going to do it 20 times. So that's a for loop. Next thing I'm going to show you is a while loop, and I want to do pretty much the same thing. So what we'll do is we're going to say while, and then in here we want to put our conditions. So let's say as long as I is less than 10. And then in here we want to do whatever we want to do through each iteration. So let's do the same thing. We'll just console.log I. Okay, and then we have to include our increment, so I++. All right, so let's run that. I is not defined. We have to actually define it outside of the while loop. All right, so we'll say var I is equal to 0. All right, and you can see it's doing the same exact thing as we did in the for loop. So the next loop I'm going to show you is a for each loop, and for each loops they're built to work with arrays. Alright, so before we do that, let's create an array. Okay, we'll call it numbers, and I'm just going to put just some random numbers in here. Okay, so we have an array of numbers, and then what we can do is we can say numbers dot for each. Alright, and then inside here we're going to put another function just like that, and in here we can put whatever we want. Let's say number, and that's what we can use in here. So console.log number. So we'll save that and reload, and you can see now we're iterating through the entire array. Now you can also use for loops or while loops with arrays. You don't have to use for each. Alright, so for an example, what we'll do is say for I, or var I is equal to 0, and then what we want to test is to say as long as I is less than the name of the arrays, which is numbers, and then we want to add on the length property, so dot length. Okay, so in this case the length is going to be 6, and then of course we need to increment. Alright, and then down here what we can do is let's console.log, and we want to say numbers and then I. Okay, so this is making it dynamic. So let's save that, reload, and you can see we get the same thing. And if we want to, let's say, output this in reverse, we could just right here say numbers dot reverse. Reload, and now you can see they're going the opposite way. So you can change it up, you can add methods to it after you create the actual array. Alright, so another part of JavaScript that is very similar to many other programming languages is conditionals. So if statements, if else, switches. If you know these in another programming language, then you're not going to have any problems with it in JavaScript. So first thing we'll take a look at is the if statement. Okay, so down in our script tags, what we're going to do is we're going to say if, and then we want to open up some parentheses and then curly braces. So in here will be the condition. So let's say if, we'll say if 1 is equal to 1. Now notice that I have two equal signs here. In JavaScript and most programming languages, if you use one equal sign, that's usually assignment. You're assigning whatever this is to this variable or this element. Alright, so when you're comparing, you want to use a double equal sign. Now, there's times when you may actually see three equal signs, and what that means, it's the same thing as double equals, except that these two data types have to match. Okay, so even if we have a 1 here as a number and then we have a 1 as a string, you want to use three equal signs to make sure that they're the same data type. In this case, they're not, because 1 is a number, 1's a string. Alright, so that's what it means if you see three of these. So let's go back and we'll say if 1 is equal to 1, then let's console.log, and we'll say this is true. Okay, and then we'll run that, and you can see that this is true. If I change this to 2, we know that 1 is obviously not equal to 2, so it gives us nothing. Alright, and we can of course use variables in here. So let's say var, we'll say var1 is equal to 3, var2 is equal to 4, and then we could just compare those. So we'll say if var1 is equal to var2, then we'll say this is true. Okay, we get nothing because obviously it's not true. If we wanted to test if it was not equal, then we could use an exclamation and then equals. Okay, so this is going to be true because var1 is not equal to var2. Okay, so let's put that back to equals. And then what if it's not true, but you want something to happen if it's not true? All right, so what we can do is we can use else. Okay, so we'll say else console.log, and we'll say this is false. All right, so now if we reload, we're going to get this is false. So another thing we can do is we can add conditions to this. We don't have to just stick to one. So let's say if var1 is equal to var2, and then we'll use and, okay, which is going to be a double ampersand. So we'll say and var1 is equal to 3. Okay, so not only does this have to be true, this also has to be true. Okay, so let's actually make it true by saying we're going to set them equal to each other, and then also var1 is equal to 3. So if we save that and run it, we get this is true. Now if I put it back, if I put the 4 back and then we try it, we get false, because even though var1 is still equal to 3, it's not equal to var2. Now what we can do here is we can say or instead of and you can do that with a double pipe character. Alright, so if we save that and reload, we get true. Alright, because although it's not equal, they're not equal to each other, var1 is equal to 3. Now another thing we can do is we can use switch statements. Alright, so let me give you an example of that. We're going to say var fruit is equal to apple. Okay, so we have a variable called fruit equal to apple. So what we want to do is run a switch statement on the fruit variable. Alright, so in here we're going to add fruit. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to create cases. So let's say case, and we'll say banana. And we want to put a colon here. And then whatever we want to happen, let's say alert, and we'll alert I hate bananas. Alright, and then we have to put in a break, okay, at the end. So that's one case, and you should probably tab these over. So in the next case, let's say apple. Okay, so for apples, we're going to say alert I love apples. Okay, and then we want to break. And let's say case orange will alert, and let's say, oops, oranges are okay. Alright, and then we want to break. And then finally, we're going to have a default. So we're going to put that. And for default, we're going to say alert I love all other fruits. Okay, and then we just want to break. Alright, so let's save this and we'll go ahead and run it. And we're getting I love apples, okay, because fruit is equal to apple. So it's calling this right here. If we set it to banana and save, we get I hate bananas. If we set it to orange and run it, oranges are okay. If we set it to, let's say, grapes, reload, I love all other fruits, because grapes is not listed as one of the cases, so it's calling the default. Alright, so that's a switch statement. Alright, so we've already talked about arrays, so now I want to talk about objects, which are kind of similar. Alright, so let's take a look at that. Alright, so there's a few different types of objects, or a few different ways to work with them. Okay, so the first one is going to be an object literal. Okay, so what we can do is we can set a variable, let's call it person, and set it to an object which uses curly braces. All right, and if you know JavaScript object notation, then this should be no problem. So first we'll give it a property of first name, okay, which will be a string, and then we'll also do a last name, which will also be a string, and then we can use a number. Okay, we'll say age, and we'll have a number type. Okay, so this is an object. It's an object called person with a first name, last name, and age. Now let's say we want to access this person's first name. Okay, so what we can do is let's do console.log, and we'll say person dot first name. Okay, objects use this dot notation. So let's save that and reload, and you can see we get Brad. Okay, if we want to get the age, we could say person dot age, and we get 34. Now we're not limited to just having one straight value for a property. We can also have arrays. Alright, so let's say we want to add children, and we want to set this to an array, and we'll put my children. Okay, so we have an array. Now if we want to access, let's say, the first one, then we can say person dot children 0. Alright, and we get Brianna. And we can certainly loop through these just like we did in a few minutes ago when we used the for loop and the for each loop or while loop. You can do that just like as if it was just a regular array. Alright, so next thing, we can also have embedded objects. Okay, so let's say we want address, and we can set that to a whole nother object. So let's say street, we'll say 555 something street, and we'll say city, Boston, and state, Mass. Alright, so what we can do here is let's say person dot address, and if I just do that, let's see what happens. Okay, that's going to actually show us the object with the street, city, and state. Now if we want to access just the state, we could just add dot state. Okay, and we get Mass. Now we can go even deeper, and we can actually include functions here as well. So let's say we want a function called full name. Okay, so we'll set that to function, and then in here let's return this dot first name. Now the keyword this is used in many different programming languages, and what it refers to is the current object that it's in, which is person. Okay, so we can access this first name using this dot first name. Alright, so let's return that, and then let's just concatenate a space, and then we'll add on this dot last name, just like that. And then down here we'll say console log person dot full name. Since it's a function, we need to include the parentheses. Alright, so let's go ahead and reload that, and we get Brad Traversy. Alright, so this is how you can encapsulate everything inside of its own object. Okay, so that's an object literal. Let's move on to an object constructor. Okay, so this is just another way to create a single object. So let's create a variable called apple, and we're going to set that to new object, just like that. And then we can add properties to it by saying apple.color. We'll set that to red, and then we'll say apple.shape. We'll set that to round. Okay, so I need a semicolon there. So what we did is created an object, and then we added some properties. Okay, if we want to add, let's say, a function, we'll say apple.describe, set that to a function, and let's do return, and we'll say an apple is the color, and then we'll just concatenate this dot color, and we'll say and is the shape, and then we'll just concatenate again, and we'll say this dot shape. Okay, we don't need that last. We can just go like that. Alright, and now what we can do is let's console log apple. Now we can just console log apple and it'll show us the object. Okay, and we can say dot color, which will give us red, or we can say apple dot describe, which is a function, and we get an apple is the color red and is the shape round. Alright, so that's another way to do it. But what isn't good about this is, let's say you want a couple different fruits. You want oranges, bananas. You'll have to do this whole thing for each fruit. Alright, so there's a much simpler way to do this. We can use a constructor pattern. Okay, so what we'll do here is we're going to say function fruit, and that's going to take in a couple parameters. Okay, we want a name of the fruit, we want a color, and a shape. Alright, and then the first thing we want to do is assign the values that are passed in as properties of fruit. So we can do this using this dot name, set that to name. We'll say this dot color, set to the color passed in, and then this dot shape set to the shape that's passed in. Okay, now before I go and create a method in here, I'm going to create a new fruit. So let's say var apple, we want to set to new fruit. Alright, and then we just want to pass in whatever we want here. So let's say apple for the name. Let's say red and round. Okay, and then let's do console.log apple. If we reload, you can see that we now have an apple. If we wanted to create, let's say, a melon, we could just say new fruit, melon, and let's change this to green. Okay, so now if we console log melon, and let's say we want the shape, we could say melon.shape, and that gives us round. So we can create methods in here which are just functions. So let's do this dot describe. Alright, actually we don't want to do that. We want to set it equal to function, and let's do return, and I'm just gonna put a string in here with some of these elements up here, or these properties. So we'll say a, and then we'll add on this dot name. Say is the color, this dot color, and is the shape, this dot shape. Okay, and then down here let's say melon dot describe, and we reload. Melon, oh, I gotta uncomment this. And there we go. Melon is the color green and is the shape round. So the more fruits we want to add, all we have to do is this one line of code instead of having to do the whole thing that we just went through with the object constructor. So hopefully that's clear to you guys. Now we can also have arrays of objects. Alright, so let's say we want a variable called users, and we'll set that to an array, but inside here we're going to have objects. Okay, so let's say name John Doe, and age, I'll say 30. All right, and then we can just put a comma here and we can add more users. Okay, so this one, we'll say Mark Smith, age 44, and then here we'll have Shelly Williams, who's 20. Okay, so now we have an array of objects, and we could do something like console.log users, and let's get we'll get the first one, so 0, and that should just give us this person right here if we reload. Okay, and we can get the specific properties if we want. We can say .name, and that'll give us John Doe. Alright, so those are objects. Alright, so one of the most important aspects of learning JavaScript is events. Alright, because JavaScript was created to make web pages interactive and dynamic, and in order to do that you need to have some kind of event handling for clicks or scrolls or drags, whatever it may be. So let's take a quick look at events. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create an element inside my container here, and actually, you know what, let's make it a button. Okay, so we have a simple button. Let's display that. Okay, obviously it's not going to do anything if we click it. What we want to do is we want to attach an event handler to this element. So what we're going to do is say onClick equals, and then what we want to happen. So what we're going to want is to run a function. Alright, so let's say do click. Okay, so on click we're going to call a function called do click. So let's create that. Down here we're going to say function do click, and let's just do an alert, and we'll say you clicked. Okay, we'll save that, reload, and we get you clicked. Okay, so it's as simple as that to create an event. Now we can do other stuff here. It doesn't have to be a custom function. Alright, for example, we can say this, which pertains to the button. We're going to say this dot inner HTML, which is a JavaScript core function, and we're going to set it to let's see, single quotes, and we're going to say you clicked. Alright, so we can get rid of that. Let's save it and go and reload and click it, and you can see that the text of the button changed to you clicked. Now you probably wouldn't want to do this. You don't really want to mix your JavaScript in with your HTML. You know, as much as you can not do that. So a better way to get that same functionality would be to, let's get rid of that, create your own function called change text. Okay, and then pass in this, and then down here you could create your function change text and pass in, let's say, ID. Okay, you're passing this in here as the ID, and then what you want to do is say ID dot inner HTML, set that to you clicked. Okay, so we'll go ahead and reload, and you can see it does the same thing, but this looks a lot neater. Now you don't have to just change the element you're in, you can change something else. For instance, let's say we want to change this heading. Alright, to do that we're going to add an ID to the heading first, and we'll just call this heading. And then once this is clicked, we don't need to pass in this anymore because we're not working with that. Alright, so we'll get rid of that. What we want to use here is a DOM function called getElementById. Alright, so we need to say document dot getElementById, and it has the ID of heading. Okay, and what we'll do is set this to a variable called heading, and then right here we're going to say heading dot inner HTML, and we'll set that to you clicked. Alright, so if we save that, reload, click the button, now you can see the heading has changed. So let's do something a little different. What I want to do is we'll have this button, and we're going to, when it clicks, I want it to show us the date. Okay, so let's change the text to show date, and let's change this here to a function called show date, and we'll change this show date. Alright, and what we want to do is let's put an element up here right above the button. Okay, we'll put an H1, and let's give it an ID of time. Alright, we're not going to actually put anything inside of it, it's just an empty element. Oops. Okay, and then in show date, what we're going to do is grab this H1. Okay, so we're going to say document dot get element by ID. Okay, this time we want to grab the ID of time, and let's actually set that to a variable. Okay, and then what we'll do is say time dot inner HTML, and we're going to set that equal to the date function. Alright, so let's save that and reload, show date, and now it gives us the date and time. Now on click isn't the only event we can use. There's a bunch of them. Alright, another one would be on mouse over. Okay, so for this one, let's save it and reload, and now if I just hover over it, it runs show date. Okay, we don't even have to click it, we just hover right over it. Now we also have one called on mouse out, so let's attach that. So on mouse out we'll set to a function called clear date. Alright, and then down here we'll create that function. And what we'll do is we'll take this, actually we'll take this whole thing and set time.innerHTML to nothing. Alright, so let's save that, reload, and you'll see that, well, it's it's kind of awkward because once I click it, you know what, let's put the date underneath so that it doesn't change positions. Okay, so I go in and it shows it that's on mouse over. When I leave it, it goes away. Okay. We also can do on load, which usually you'll attach to the body. If you have something that you want to run when the page loads, a lot of times you'll attach this to the body. So we'll say on load, and let's say show date. Alright, if we save that and we reload, you can see that the date is now shown. Alright, so let's move on to forms. Alright, I want to talk about forms because JavaScript plays a really big role in form validation and other types of functionality with forms. So let's take a quick look at that. Alright, so I've created a very simple form here with 3 fields. We have first name, last name, and we have a background color select box. So what I want to do is just show you how we can link some events to some of the form fields we have, and also how to do just very simple form validation. So before we go into validation, I just want to show you how we can link this select box to change the body background of our application or website. Okay, so what we're going to do is we have our select, Okay, and we're just going to add to the select tag, we're going to add on change, and we're going to set that to change background. Okay, and we want to pass in this because we want this select element. So down here we'll create a function called change background. Alright, and that's going to take in, let's just put X here. Okay, that's going to represent this. So let's test it out and say console.log, and we'll just say hello, just to make sure the event works. So let's reload and we'll just change it. Okay, notice I didn't submit the form, I'm just changing the select list. Okay, we're getting hello. Let's see what happens if we console log X. Okay, so what that's doing is it's giving us the entire select element. So we can access anything we want in here. For example, to get the actual value, we can say x dot value. Okay, we'll reload, choose blue, and you'll see down here we get blue, green, red. Okay, so now we have access to the value there. So what we want to do is we want to change the CSS of the body to whatever that value is. Alright, the background of the body. So first thing I'm going to do is in the body tag, I'm just going to add an ID to it called body. Okay, and then down here what we'll do is create a variable called body, set that to document dot get element by ID, and we want the ID of body. Okay, so now we have that that element. What we want to do is say body, and then we're going to call style. Okay, dot style, and then the actual CSS that we want to change is background color. All right, and we just want to set that equal to x dot value. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that and reload, and now let's choose blue, and you can see the whole body changes. Green, red. Alright, now let's say we just want to change the heading here. We could just change this to heading, and let's see, does it have, yeah, it has an ID of heading, so I can just change that. Heading, and instead of background color, let's just change color. Okay, so now if I change that to blue, you can see the headings blue, green, and red. Okay, so this is a perfect example of how JavaScript makes things dynamic and interactive. So now let's move on. What we're going to do is just very simple form validation. We want the first name to be a required field, and we shouldn't be able to submit the form if the first name is blank, and then we'll also add a rule saying it has to be at least 3 characters. So let's just delete this, we don't need that. Okay, actually we don't need the background select list at all anymore. Alright, and I'm just going to take the ID off of body. Okay, so what we want to do, we want to figure out what event we want to use here. So when you're working with a form, you probably want to use on submit. So let's put that in here. We're going to say on submit, and we're going to set that equal to return validate form. Okay, so let's create that down here. We'll say function validate form. Okay, and first thing we want to do is grab the first name input element. So to do that, we'll say first name. Now I should mention that when you're doing something like this, it's probably a good idea to use jQuery or something like that, some kind of JavaScript library. It makes things a lot easier, it shortens your code, The reason I'm not showing you that is because this is a strictly JavaScript tutorial, and I think you should learn how to do that first. But after that, just look into jQuery, because it's a lot easier to select different elements from the DOM. Okay, so but just to show you how we can do it with pure JavaScript, we can use document.forms. Okay, and what that's going to do is it's going to look at all the forms. Now we want to be specific. This form has a name of my form, so we can actually use that. So we're going to open up some brackets and we'll say my form, and then we want the first name, so we're going to specify that. Okay, and then we're going to say dot value. Okay, so that's going to give us the value. You could have also used document.getElementById on the input form, but this is just another way to do it. So what we want to do is we want to run a check on that first name. Okay, so we want to say if first name is equal to null, or first name is equal to nothing. Okay, so if that's true, then we're going to alert. We're going to let the user know. Say first name is required. Alright, and then you want to be sure to return false, which is going to stop the form from submitting. Alright, so let's save that, and we'll go ahead and reload, and let's try to submit, and it's giving us first name is required. Okay, if I put something in there and submit, it lets us go through. And I just have it going to a file called something.php. Alright, because usually you would submit a form to either PHP or some other kind of server language file. Alright, so that's that. Now let's say we also want to check it and make sure that there's at least 3 characters. So what we'll do is let's copy that, and we'll say if first name dot length, because remember all objects have properties. Length is one of the properties. So we'll say if length is less than 3, we'll say first name must be at least 3 characters and return false. Okay, so if we reload and we put 1 character in, submit, it's telling us it must be 3 characters. If we put more than 3, submit, it goes through. Alright, so that's the very, very basics of form validation with JavaScript. And you should also have some kind of form validation on your server side if you're using PHP or whatever it may be, because JavaScript is only done on the client. Alright, so that's going to be it for this short. Well, it wasn't that short. I actually wanted it to be a little shorter than this, but hopefully you learned something from it, at least the fundamentals of not only JavaScript but programming in general, because things like loops, arrays, variables, these things are global to most programming languages. Alright, so if you liked the video, please subscribe, please leave a like. You can leave a dislike if you didn't like it, and I will see you next time.